The words hit me like a physical blow. She's a glorified nursemaid who manipulated a dying man. My sister Sienna's lawyer stood 15 feet away, his finger pointed at my face like a weapon, and I felt every syllable land in my chest. The courtroom wasn't spinning exactly, but the edges of my vision had gone soft, blurred. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, a dull thud that drowned out the murmurs from the gallery behind me. My mother, Patricia, clutched Sienna's hand in the front row, her face arranged in what she probably thought looked like grief, but mostly just looked expensive. Sienna let out a sob that sounded rehearsed, practiced. "She stole our last years with him," she cried, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. The judge's voice cut through the fog. "Miss Voss, do you object?" I didn't stand. I just checked my watch and forced my hands to stop shaking. "Not yet, Your Honor. I'm waiting for the real estate attorney." The confusion on Sienna's face almost made the last 3 years worth it. "My name is Maya. I'm 29 and a private estate manager. This is the story of how I stopped being the family bank. For the last decade of his life, I was the only one who showed up for Grandpa Edmund, not just for holidays or when they needed something, but for the Tuesday morning doctor's appointments and the midnight panic attacks when his COPD made breathing feel impossible. I was the one who learned to change oxygen tanks, measure morphine doses, and hold his hand while he cried about outliving his wife. My parents, Richard and Patricia, had their own lives, important lives. Richard's consulting business, Patricia's charity galas. My sister Sienna had her boutique yoga studio and her influencer brand to maintain. They were busy people with busy schedules. I was busy too, managing estates for clients who actually paid me. But Grandpa never felt like work. He felt like the only person in my family who had ever looked at me and seen someone worth knowing. The emergency petition they'd filed that morning claimed he'd been incompetent when he signed his trust documents. They wanted immediate control of his $8 million estate, claiming I'd isolated him, manipulated him, held him hostage in his own home. They said he couldn't be trusted with $5, let alone his life's work. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this exact moment since the day Grandpa called me into his study 3 years ago and said, "Maya, when I'm gone, they're going to come for you. We need to build a fortress." The oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The man who walked in wasn't wearing Italian silk like Sienna's lawyer. He wore a gray off-the-rack suit that hung loose in the shoulders and carried a briefcase that looked like it had survived multiple decades. He walked straight to the clerk's desk and placed a thick, sealed envelope on the wood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the dry precision of someone who'd spent 40 years in banking. "I'm representing the Trust Department of Hawthorne National Bank. We're the successor trustee for the Edmund Voss estate." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Sienna's lawyer shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. "Objection. We haven't been notified of any corporate trustee. This is a probate matter involving—" "Sit down, counsel." The judge was already slicing open the envelope, the sound of tearing paper the only noise in the suddenly silent courtroom. I watched my mother's hands clenched together in her lap, knuckles going white. She looked at me across the aisle, confusion mixing with something sharper in her eyes. She wanted to see fear. She'd spent 15 years training me to be afraid of them. But I wasn't the scared 14-year-old girl anymore. I was the one who'd driven Grandpa to that bank 3 years ago. I was the one who'd sat in the lobby while he signed the papers. I knew exactly what was in that envelope. The judge pulled out the document, scanning the header. Then he peered over his reading glasses at Sienna. "Miss Voss, are you aware that your grandfather's assets were placed into an irrevocable trust prior to his death?" Sienna blinked, her carefully applied mascara suddenly looking too heavy. He was confused. That's why we're here. He didn't know what he was doing. "The certification of trust says otherwise." The judge turned a page, and it contains a very specific provision regarding legal challenges. He cleared his throat and read aloud, "Article 9, Section C. No contest clause. Any beneficiary who seeks to invalidate this trust or challenges the competency of the grantor shall immediately forfeit any and all interest in the trust estate, treating said beneficiary as if they had predeceased the grantor." The silence that followed felt alive, breathing. My father Richard's mouth hung slightly open. He was a man who'd built a career on intimidation, on making people back down. I'd watched him bully waiters and contractors and me for my entire life. But now he stared at the man in the cheap suit with something I'd never seen on his face before. Pure, undiluted fear. You can't bully a bank. You can't gaslight a contract. Sienna's lawyer looked like he'd just been punched in the stomach. He knew exactly what had happened. By filing this emergency petition claiming Grandpa was incompetent, they hadn't just started a legal fight. They'd pulled the pin on a grenade while holding it in their hands. "Your Honor," the lawyer stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "We withdraw the motion. We were acting on incomplete." "The motion is already filed and entered into the record," the judge said, closing the folder with a decisive snap. "The trust is active. The trustee is present. The assets are secure. Your request for emergency control is denied." My mother let out a sharp gasp, grabbing Richard's arm like she was drowning. Sienna turned to me, her eyes wide. "You knew," she hissed, loud enough that the bailiff stepped forward. "You set us up." I looked her dead in the eye. "I told you 3 months ago to wait. You didn't listen." They thought they were fighting a helpless little sister who'd spent her whole life cleaning up their messes. They forgot that I'd spent the last decade managing estates for people far more powerful and calculating than they'd ever be. I didn't need to scream or threaten. I just needed to let them sign their names on the dotted line. The trap had snapped shut. They were the ones who set the bait. The courtroom buzzed with low, frantic energy. Sienna's lawyer was leaning over the table, whispering frantically to my parents. My mother looked like she wanted to disappear into her designer coat. My father just stared at the empty space where his millions used to be, his face turning an alarming shade of red. For the first time in my life, they looked small. I leaned back in my chair and watched them unravel. It was fascinating, like watching a building collapse in slow motion. You see the cracks spreading before you hear the sound. And as I watched Richard wipe sweat from his upper lip with a shaking hand, the memory came rushing back, sharp and clear as broken glass. I was suddenly transported out of that courtroom and back into our kitchen 15 years ago. The air smelled like cheap scotch and desperation. I was 14. My jaw was swollen from emergency dental surgery that morning, throbbing with a dull, rusty ache. My bite had been so misaligned that it was grinding my molars to dust, causing migraines that made me black out in class. The surgery had cost $12,000. That same week, my parents' construction business had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. They sat me down at the kitchen table. My mother was crying, the same performative sobs she was using right now in court. My father was pacing, scotch sloshing over his knuckles. "We lost everything," Richard had roared, slamming his hand on the table hard enough to make the salt shaker jump. "The house, the trucks, the contracts, gone." He pointed a shaking finger at my swollen face. "Because of her," he told my mother, talking around me like I was furniture. "If we hadn't spent that capital on her teeth, we could have floated the loan. We could have survived the quarter. She bled us dry." I believed him. God help me, I believed him. I sat there, 14 years old, mouth full of cotton gauze, and accepted the weight of their failure. I took it onto my narrow shoulders and carried it for the next 15 years. They told that story to everyone. Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas parties. We'd still be in the big house if Maya hadn't needed that surgery. It became family legend, a jagged rock they could throw at me whenever they needed someone to blame for their own incompetence. Sienna was only 3 years old at the time, too young to understand what was happening. But as she grew older, and the story got told and retold at every family gathering, she absorbed it like gospel. By the time she was a teenager, she looked at me the same way our parents did, like I was the reason for every hardship, every missed opportunity. She was the phoenix, the fresh start, the daughter who hadn't ruined everything. She got the dance lessons, the private tutors, the unconditional love. I got the bill. I spent my 20s paying a debt that didn't exist. I covered their rent when Richard forgot to save for taxes. I bought their groceries when Patricia spent the food budget on networking lunches. I thought if I paid enough, if I bled enough, eventually the ledger would balance. Eventually, they'd forgive me for being born. It wasn't until I started working for my boss, a man who actually understood how money works, that I finally ran the numbers. $12,000 doesn't bankrupt a multi-million-dollar company. Fraud does. Embezzlement does. Spending operating capital on vacations and luxury cars does. They didn't lose the business because of my teeth. They lost it because they were greedy, stupid, and arrogant. But narcissists can't look in the mirror. They can't hold their own shame. They need a trash can. I was the trash can for 15 years. I looked across the courtroom at them now, pulled back to the present moment by the sound of Sienna's lawyer clearing his throat. Richard caught my eye. His expression shifted into something familiar. That look he used to give me when he needed rent money, expectant, demanding, assuming I would fix this because I owed him. He opened his mouth, probably to say, "Handle this." I held his gaze. I didn't blink. I let the silence stretch between us, cold and heavy as a gravestone. You blamed me for your bankruptcy, I thought. You made me carry your shame for 15 years while I kept a roof over your heads. You wanted a burden? You just found one. The ledger was closed. I wasn't paying anymore. Sienna went completely still, the kind of stillness that happens right before glass shatters. The judge had just told her that by filing this motion, she'd effectively written herself out of the will. $8 million was evaporating in front of her eyes. I watched the realization hit her. It wasn't grief. It was the terrifying math of a lifestyle she could no longer afford. She stood up, hands gripping the table until her knuckles turned white. Then the tears came. Instant, flooding, racking sobs worthy of an Academy Award. "He wasn't in his right mind," she wailed, turning to face the gallery, then the judge. "She made him do this. She brainwashed him." The judge frowned. "Miss Voss, those are serious allegations." "It's the truth." Sienna pointed a shaking finger at me. "She isolated him. She changed the locks. For 3 years we tried to see him, and she treated him like a prisoner. That trust isn't his will. It's hers." It was the nuclear option. Elder abuse, undue influence, the magic words that freeze probate courts and launch investigations. My father saw his opening. He jumped up, ignoring his lawyer's restraining hand. "It's true, Your Honor. She physically barred us from the property." His voice boomed with righteous indignation. "Last Christmas Eve, we drove there to give my father his presents. We stood on the porch in the freezing cold, begging to see him. She locked the door and laughed at us through the window. She wouldn't let a son see his dying father on Christmas." The gallery murmured. The judge looked at me, his expression darkening. It was a good story, a compelling story, a cruel daughter keeping a loving family away from a dying man on Christmas. I kept my face blank, but in my head I was back in that hallway. December 24th, 11:30 p.m. Grandpa was in the hospital bed we'd set up in his living room, on high-flow oxygen, his lungs failing. His anxiety spiked every time a car door slammed outside. I was measuring his morphine dose when the pounding started. Not a knock. A fist hammering against wood like they were trying to break through it. I crept to the peephole. Richard and Patricia were there wearing Santa hats and holding wine glasses that were mostly empty. They were swaying, stumbling. They weren't there to visit. They were there because they'd left a party early and wanted to perform a heartwarming family moment for Patricia's Instagram. "Open up, you little leech!" Richard had screamed through the door. "We know he's in there." Grandpa had grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't let them in," he wheezed, his oxygen monitor beeping in alarm. "Please, Maya, I don't want them to see me like this." I checked the deadbolt, turned off the porch light, sat on the floor beside his bed, and held his hand until the pounding stopped and their car peeled out of the driveway. That was their loving Christmas visit, a drunken raid in the middle of the night that nearly gave a dying man a heart attack. But in Richard's mind, he was the victim. He believed his own lie. That's the thing about narcissists. They rewrite history to make themselves the hero of every tragedy. "Your Honor," Sienna's lawyer said, seizing the momentum, "if the decedent was isolated and coerced, the trust is invalid. We move to suspend the trustee's authority pending an investigation into elder abuse." The judge looked at me. "Miss Voss, do you have a response to these claims?" My palms were sweating, but I kept my hands folded on the table. This was the moment. If I argued, it was my word against theirs. If I screamed, I looked unstable. I needed them to commit. I needed them to put it on the record under oath. I looked at the trustee and gave him a single, small nod. I stayed silent. "Counsel," the judge said, turning to the man in the cheap suit, "does the trustee have any evidence regarding these allegations of isolation? Was the decedent prevented from communicating with his family?" The trustee didn't rush. He opened his briefcase with deliberate care and pulled out a heavy leather-bound book. It was battered, the spine cracked from years of use. It was Grandpa's journal. "We do, Your Honor," the trustee said, "but it doesn't show that Miss Voss isolated the decedent. It shows that the petitioners abandoned him." He walked to the clerk's desk and placed the journal on top of a stack of papers. "I'm marking this as Exhibit B, the decedent's personal log, and I'm pairing it with Exhibit C, 5 years of itemized phone records for the account registered to Edmund Voss." Sienna stopped crying mid-sob. The sudden silence from her side of the room was more telling than her tears had been. She stared at that book like it was a bomb. "Make your case," the judge ordered. The trustee opened the book to a marked page. Entry dated March 12th, the petitioner Sienna Voss's birthday. He read Grandpa's handwriting, his voice void of emotion. Called Sienna to sing happy birthday. Sent a voicemail, no call back. Then he picked up the phone bill. Phone record for March 12th. Outgoing call to the number ending in 4492. Duration 40 seconds. No incoming calls from that number for the remainder of the month. My mother winced. Sienna looked down at her hands. The trustee turned the page. Entry dated June 19th, Father's Day. Waited for Richard. He said he'd stop by after golf. Never showed. Maya made steak. He held up the phone bill. No incoming calls from Richard Voss on that date. One outgoing text from the decedent at 8 p.m. asking, "Are you coming?" No reply. It was a massacre, a slow, methodical dismantling of their entire narrative. Every time they claimed they were too busy, Grandpa had written it down. Every time they promised to visit and ghosted him, he documented it. The ledger was a timeline of their selfishness, written in the shaky hand of a man who just wanted to see his family. Richard's face was turning purple. "This is private," he sputtered. "You can't read a dead man's diary in court." "It's evidence of state of mind," the judge said coldly. "Sit down." The trustee flipped to the final marked page. Entry dated December 24th, Christmas Eve. The room went deadly still. This was the night Richard had just testified about under oath. The night he claimed I'd barred him from the house out of cruelty. The trustee read from the ledger. 11:45 p.m. Richard and Patricia arrived drunk, pounding on the door and shouting. It scared me. Heart rate hit 160 on the monitor. Maya kept the door locked. I didn't want them to see me like this. He set the book down. Phone records show a 911 call initiated at 11:48 p.m. from the decedent's phone, ended before connecting when the knocking stopped. In that moment, the loving son's story collapsed. The court didn't see victims anymore. They saw a drunk man tormenting his dying father on Christmas Eve. Richard shrank in his chair, exposed. "Mr. Voss," the trustee said quietly, "Maya Voss didn't isolate your father. She protected him." Sienna's lawyer glanced at the evidence stacked against them and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, perhaps we could take a brief recess to—" "Denied," the judge said. "You made the accusation. You opened this door. Now we walk through it." He turned to me. "Miss Voss claims your grandfather was incompetent when he signed the trust. Do you have a response?" I nodded. It was time. "Yes, Your Honor. I didn't just care for him. I managed him. And I knew this day would come." Sienna's lawyer lunged forward. He was 89 years old on heavy pain medication. He was paranoid. A scribbled notebook isn't proof. It's proof of decline. Sienna piled on. "He mixed up our names. Maya put a pen in his hand when he didn't know what he was signing." The judge looked at the trustee. "Does the bank have capacity evidence?" The trustee looked at me. My cue. "I didn't just put a pen in his hand," I said. "I managed his schedule. I managed his estate. And I knew the second he died, they'd come for the money and call him crazy." I faced the judge directly. The morning the trust was amended, I scheduled 2 appointments before we went to the bank. The trustee produced another file. Exhibit D, an affidavit of capacity signed by Dr. Sarah Chen and Dr. Michael Okonkwo, both forensic psychiatrists, completed 2 hours before the trust signing. Both doctors found Mr. Voss oriented, lucid, and fully aware of his finances and family dynamics. The sessions were video recorded. He placed a flash drive on the clerk's desk. In the recordings, Mr. Voss plainly states he's protecting his legacy from what he called Sienna's spending plans and Richard's track record with money. Sienna went pale. "Those doctors cost $5,000 a day," she said, her voice shrill. "I didn't pay them," I said calmly. "I scheduled them." The trustee held up 2 canceled checks, paid from the decedent's account, signed by Edmund Voss himself. Memo line reads, "Capacity exam." Both checks cleared 3 months ago. Silence. The judge's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. The petitioners just swore under oath that Edmund Voss was incompetent. Yet this court now has video evidence and expert testimony proving he was completely lucid when he signed these documents." He looked at Sienna's lawyer. "That's perjury, counsel. And since this petition sought to seize assets based on that fraudulent claim, it's also attempted theft." The lawyer went white. "This petition is dismissed with prejudice," the judge said. "I'm ordering a sanctions hearing for next month. And since the petitioners have challenged the grantor's competency in a legal proceeding, the no contest clause is triggered." He looked at Sienna and my parents. "You leave this courtroom with nothing." The gavel fell like a gunshot. Minutes later, I stepped outside into the cold parking lot. My family looked destroyed beside their leased Mercedes. Richard tried to approach me, his hands raised like he wanted to negotiate. "Maya, come on, we can appeal this. We can split the money. You don't need all of it. We're family." I stared at him. "We're family," I repeated. "Like when you put the utilities in my name and ruined my credit? Or when you borrowed my car and totaled it, then told the insurance it was my fault? That kind of family?" "We made mistakes," Patricia said, her voice breaking. "But we're your parents. You can't just—" "Take care of you?" I finished. "The way you took care of me? By blaming me for your bankruptcy when I was 14? By making me pay your rent for 10 years? Richard's face was red. "We have debts. We're going to lose the house." "You were finished 15 years ago," I said flatly. "You just used me to keep the lights on." Sienna lunged forward and grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. "You can't do this to us." I didn't flinch. "Let go of me, or I call the trustee and add assault to the list of reasons you should stay away from me." She dropped my arm like it burned. I unlocked my car. My mother let out a wail. "We have nothing. You're leaving us with nothing." I started the engine and looked my father in the eye through the window. "You're right, Dad. You have nothing. But at least you don't have a burden anymore." I drove away. In my rearview mirror, I watched them standing in the parking lot. 3 people who used to have power over me, now just strangers in expensive clothes they couldn't afford. 3 weeks later, the trustee called with the final numbers. The transfer was complete. Liquid assets deposited, deeds recorded. The court entered the final order. The entire $8 million estate had been transferred to me as the sole remaining beneficiary. Every account, every property, every investment Grandpa had built over his lifetime was now legally mine. The sanctions hearing had concluded 2 days prior. The judge fined Sienna's lawyer $30,000 for filing a frivolous petition and referred him to the state bar for disciplinary review. My parents and Sienna were each hit with $50,000 in sanctions for bringing false claims under oath, on top of the $150,000 in legal fees they already owed. Sienna filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy the same afternoon the sanctions were entered. During discovery, auditors found discrepancies in my parents' business debt story, the one they'd blamed me for. An IRS audit was underway. 6 months later, I received a letter from their attorney. The audit had resulted in a $200,000 tax assessment for unreported income and fraudulent deductions. They were facing both the debt and potential criminal charges for tax evasion. I sat in Grandpa's study, my study now, the room that still smelled faintly of his aftershave and old books. The battered leather ledger sat on the desk in front of me, the book that had saved me. I opened it to the last entry. written 3 days before he died. Maya is the only one who came when it mattered, the only one who paid her dues without asking what she'd get in return. When I'm gone, they'll try to take everything from her because that's all they know how to do. This trust isn't just about money. It's about making sure the one person who deserves it doesn't get destroyed by the people who only ever saw her as a bank account. I closed the book gently. Then I opened my phone contacts. Dad, Mom, Sienna. I didn't block them. I hit delete one by one. They weren't family anymore, just strangers who used to know a girl who paid their rent. And this time, when they came knocking, I didn't answer the door. Before you go, here's a quick bonus for sticking around. If you love learning and growing like I do, you need to try audiobooks. I've got an exclusive deal with Audible. Your first month is completely free. That's access to over 500,000 titles, zero cost to you. All the details are waiting in the description. Don't miss this one.